Morning everyone, and welcome to today's session. And I'm going to welcome those who are watching either through the public gallery or through the live stream. Today's session relates to flood risk, and without wanting to cause confusion straight away, Mr. Higginson, it would be so much easier if you just sat on the side with the council. Would you mind doing that? And then that way I'm not going like that, which seems I'll give you a couple of minutes to get settled. Thank you, Mr. Wilder. You feel comfortable? You're not Mr. Wilder, you're Mr. Higginson. I need to apologise. Okay, as I say, I'm the planning inspector. I've been tasked with examining this plan to check it's sound and meets legal compliance. Obviously, no one's here with a mobile phone, or at least you know that you're not to have it on. So there's nothing, Mrs. Clancy will give us a quick update regarding security and evacuation procedures.
Good morning, everyone. Just the fire safety procedure. The building fire alarm is a continuous two-tone siren. On hearing the siren, leave the building by the nearest marked exit. From the public gallery, leave by the stairs, do not use the lift. Follow the green signs to the assembly points, large staff car park opposite the entrance to the building, and do not return to the building until told it is safe to do so. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Let's begin. Okay. My first question's related to has the preparation of the plan and its policies been informed by paragraphs 159 to 165 of the framework? I suppose the obvious question to that relates, follow-up to question to that relates to the fact that the SFRA was produced post-submission, or at least the up-to-date SFRA was produced post-submission, and whilst this was raised at the SA period situation, but I'm going to raise it again just for clarity. Whilst I understood that there was maps that were up-to-date maps, the climate change thresholds weren't up-to-date, and those are the things that have really altered the flood risk assessment. Is that correct?
That's great. If it's helpful to give you a chronology of our SFRA work, we're happy to do that, and how that's informed the plan. I think that might be helpful given the statement of common ground with the Environment Agency on this matter.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So the original SFRA document was produced in 2015. And as we note in our hearing statement, that's been kept continually up to date from a mapping perspective. So that includes all of our historic flood event data from the District Council and from the county, the Environment Agency's flood zone and surface water mapping. So that has been, any updates that are made to that live data set are essentially our live SFRA which we used in the formation of the plan. The 2015 SFRA live mapping included an agreed climate change allowance buffer that was agreed with the Environment Agency, and that was agreed as a 20-metre horizontal buffer as our climate change allowance. Just for clarity, the new SFRA, it comes to the same conclusion, it's the same 20-metre horizontal buffer. But most importantly are the response from the Environment Agency Regulation 18 stage, which said to us that it was worth us considering updating our SFRA due to climate change changes, and that could be done as a light review or a light touch update. We embarked on that piece of work, but the Environment Agency in their Statement of Common Ground, under the evidence base heading, agree that the 2015 SFRA report was based upon live mapping data, therefore supported by the most up-to-date data set, and was an appropriate basis to carry out high-level assessment.
Sorry, can you just get me to the right paragraph?
Yes, it is document DC16.
I've got it, there's no paragraph numbers actually.
Yeah, it's the page after the signatures, third page, under evidence base, second paragraph. And it's the last sentence. So that's the position, their position in relation to the 2015 SFRA report. That work was ongoing, an update to that work, and you'll see from the document issue of ENV 11, which is the new SFRA, that we received first draft for consultation and the revisions based on the comments in March and April this year. So well ahead of submission, and our internal checks at that point were to look through the site selection, look through the allocations, and
sorry.
Yeah, so this is page 2, or the very first page behind the front cover of ENV 11, where the issue date is March this year, and that's good for 5 months before submission.
But that's for the first draft, not the final document, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah.
But saying that, obviously the plan went to Reg 19 earlier, prior to this, didn't it?
It did, and that, we agree that's the case, but again, I would draw your attention to the Environment Agency's view on that matter, that the data that we had was an appropriate basis to carry out that high-level assessment of site selection and sustainability appraisal.
Could you argue it was a happy coincidence rather than anything else that this was the case?
I think we would argue that if the revised SFRA that we received in March this year was telling us something different, we would have taken a different course of events, but it didn't.
Thank you, ma'am, for the live stream. My name is Tim Higginson. I'm here representing Wild. The first point I'd like to make, just to confirm the matter of fact, is that the latest SFRAs were produced after the event, after the plan was submitted. The Council's position, as I understand it, is that the 2015 plan was used is still relevant because it was kept up to date, and that's supported by the Environment Agency. Paragraph 160 of the NPPF says strategic policies should consider cumulative impacts in or affecting local areas susceptible to flooding and take advice from the Environment Agency and other bodies. I've quoted that to show that the advice of the Environment Agency and other bodies is not sufficient in itself. The Council has a duty to consider cumulative impacts on local areas in addition to the EA's advice, and to do that it will require local data. In sections 52, 4 to 6 of their hearing statement, the Council refers repeatedly to the Environment Agency, and we've heard that just now, and the other relevant bodies, but not to its duty in the first half of the quoted sentence and the information they would need to discharge it. In our view, the 2015 study cannot be relied on to support this plan. That's why the Environment Agency said that the Council should produce an update. The information in the 2015 study, leaving aside Environment Agency mapping, is almost 10 years old, and it was produced to support assessment of sites in the last plan, not in this one. Much has happened in the last decade in terms of the impact of climate change generally, and on particular locations, and on our understanding of it. And in fact, the NPPF was only updated to include all causes of flood risk in July 2021. But there is one respect in which the 2015 report is highly relevant, because it met the requirement of both clauses in the sentence I've quoted from paragraph 160. And in that respect, it shows what the Council should have done, but didn't do. I refer to page 149 of the 2015 report, which records the Council contacting town and parish councils for flooding information. That initiative resulted in the evidence set out in tabular form later. So from page 65, for example, the report describes numerous examples of flooding in Sayers Common. That exercise was not undertaken in the 2024 SFRA Level 1 study, which relies on information from the Environment Agency alone. The table beginning on page 31 of the 2024 study summarises neighbourhood plans, but all it does is identify whether they have relevant flooding policies. Had the authors recorded details of historic flooding listed in, for example, the Hurst and Sayers Common neighbourhood plan, they would have had plenty to summarise. And the section on historic flooding, page 76, which summarises the Council's own records, acknowledges that these records are not extensive. Nor was proper data collection undertaken in the Level 2 study. Section 2 of that document shows that that study also relied only on Environment Agency data. Section 2.8 does refer to historic flooding, but as we can see from Appendix 1 to that document, it turns out to be incomplete and out of date. So in our view, these studies don't meet the requirements of the NPPF in paragraph 160.
Thank you, Mr. Higginson. I'd like to, I will come back to that. I will ask the, well, probably easier actually if I just ask the council how it dealt with recorded instances of historic flooding, or even whether it looked to ask other issues, because you've got the relevant flood management authorities, such as lead local flood authorities and internal drainage boards in the framework. There's no reference to local people, but saying that if in the 2015 study you had done that, I suppose the question is why you didn't in this study and if it impacts in terms on the soundness of the plan.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, I mean, if we look at ENV 11 of that's a strategic flood risk assessment, the revised version, paragraph 1.10 lists the parties that have been consulted upon. Admittedly, that doesn't include the town and parish councils, but it has got the county council as lead local flood authority, and our own internal records for planning, emergency planning, flood management, and our own historic records, which are themselves based on historic flood events and information provided to us on a regular basis as a result of any flood event in any town or parish. And then on paragraph 1.13 onwards, table 1, is a wide range of data sources, including our own information about events from the Environment Agency, as Mr Higginson has mentioned, records from the lead local flood authority, and records from Southern Water in this instance, and Thames Water in other parts of the district. And so I think it's a wide range of people that have been consulted and a wide range of sources that have been used in this SFRA. And I don't think there will be a gap in terms of what Mr Higginson's saying about if we contacted the parish council in this instance, all of those, as far as I'm aware, all of those events that Mr Higginson has noted historically would have been reported to either us, the lead local flood authority, or Southern Water. And so that data is captured in that long list of people that we've consulted and in the long list of data sources that have been used.
So you're saying that really there's no divergence between what Mr Higginson as a resident of that area, assuming you are a resident of that area? Yes. Yeah. And the council's records, which so I suppose that begs the obvious question, why does Mr Higginson think that there is? Higginson, perhaps you could respond.
Thank you. There will be a number of local residents who have responded to consultation raising issues around flooding in Sayers Common. We mentioned this in our hearing statement, and for example, in the hearing statements for this examination, Mrs Simmons has also raised these points. There is a clear gap and gulf between the experience of local residents and the issues they believe they have raised, and what is recorded in these studies. And again, I refer to Appendix 1 of the 2024 SFRA 2, which basically says there are no records of sewage problems or flooding in these particular site allocations relating to Sayers Common. As we speak, Southern Water are in Sayers Common, addressing the problems that they know exist and are currently working on and have been working on for some time.
Mr Marsh, could you just come back and try and square that?
Yeah,
Apparent circle, I'm not saying there is necessarily an apparent circle to be squared, but I just want you to...
Of course, so with reference particularly to Sayers Common, I think what Mr Higginson saying about the SFRA level 2 and not recording the issues there. The issues in Sayers Common are related to the foul sewer network, and the historic records are of the events that have occurred. None of those are within the site boundary of the site allocation. That's a greenfield DPSC Bury in particular. None of those are within the site boundary. They are all outside the site boundary. And we recognise that, as do the site promoters who I think we heard on one of the first days of the hearing, we were talking about infrastructure and Section 106. If you recall, they mentioned the betterment that would arise from their scheme, in that in order to develop their scheme, they would need to upgrade the foul network, and have indeed, we have safeguarded some land for a new pumping station off-site and water treatment, foul treatment. So the site promoter's view is that, and ours is, which we agree with, is that there is no issue within the site boundary. There is an issue outside the site boundary, but the site would improve that position rather than make it worse. So I think that's all on this specific matter that Mr. Higginson's raised. I think hopefully that circles the circle.
Thank you. Obviously, I don't want to home in on Sayers Common because we'll be looking at flood risk when we look at the site allocation process. So anyone from Sayers Common, this is where you breathe a sigh of relief that I'm not going to be determining that. It's just really a question of general question. So are you saying that clearly if a site is a greenfield site, you're not going to have any objection, you're not going to have many toilets backing up on a greenfield site, are you? Unless there's something very strange going on.
You could have a nearby sewage pipe which for one reason or other overflowed onto a greenfield site. And in that sense, there may be records of sewage-related flooding on that particular site, but that's not the case here. I think what Mr. Marsh is saying is that when you look at the reference to no record, it's talking about no record on the allocated site, and and recognise that there are wider issues in Sayers Common, but they are not issues which have flooded the site. The surface water is referred to, but the sewage-related flooding, there is no record of on the site itself, and that's why the SFRA records that.
Okay. I am actually aware that we're not actually introducing ourselves, which for us is fine, but for people who are following...
Apologies, ma'am.
And who are following perhaps a transcript, that would make it very difficult. In terms of, I just want to dig in terms of paragraph 160, where it says they should consider cumulative impacts in or affecting local areas susceptible to flooding and take an account of all these issues. Now, would a local area necessarily equate to a site, or would it equate to a wider area?
So the paragraph itself, they should consider cumulative impacts would be wider than site, in my view. However, in particular, in this instance in Sayers Common, because it was... I'm not talking about Sayers Common, I'm just talking about principle. Okay, in principle.
No, I think the answer was, the reference to cumulative indicates that it is wider than just the site.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul Brown. Council, wow.
Yes. Familiarity breeds contempt, or at least forgetting to introduce ourselves. Yes. But, so in terms of the historic evidence, should that be provided as cumulative evidence?
Well, the historic evidence is in the SFRA. So the historic evidence, so Appendix A, MSCC and WSC historic records, and there's a whole series of historic records there, which are both in and outside the site.
albeit, planning inspector.
Sorry, I didn't either. Andrew Marsh, Mid-Sussex District Council.
Albeit the people at, the local residents consider that not all of those instances have been adequately recorded. So that's correct, isn't it? I mean, whether they have been or not is a moot point, but I'm just putting for the record, albeit that is the case.
It's a case that it is correct clearly correct. Mr. Higginson doesn't think all of those are recorded, but our records are extensive, and from a reliable source of both our internal Southern Water, Lead Local Flood Authority.
Local residents give rise to an issue which is already raised.
Okay, so in terms of, Inspector, yeah. In terms of the instances which have come forward as a result of the consultation process, what status do they have on the basis that the SFRA was produced in 2024?
So the instances of historic flooding, as I mentioned earlier on, are added to our live system. So in terms of Appendix A of this SFRA, you'll see there's a whole series of them which were before this SFRA was published, and therefore they would already sit within our live mapping. So, for example, on the very first page of Appendix A, you can see even on that first page under year 2016, 2019, 2013, etc., are sitting in our live system. The point Mr. Higginson raised is about matters that arose in the consultation responses. The consultation responses have been shared where we have received instances of flooding. Our view on that is that they would only be duplicating what is sitting in here, or it would increase the frequency, but not the locations wouldn't change, because the records in Appendix A are comprehensive. They mention Rees Lane and Dunlop Close and others in Sayers Common, which we've been very aware of. And I'm sure will be the same locations that Mr. Higginson would be referring to.
Planning inspector. So what you're really saying is that the consultation responses which have referenced flooding, they will relate to events which the council is already familiar with, and therefore whilst there may be, say, X responses relating to one particular instance, it still doesn't alter the case that there's only been one instance.
Either that, ma'am, or it'll be an event which perhaps... Sorry, Mr. Brown for the council. I do apologise, ma'am. Either that or it will be an event which may be a new event, but in a location about which the council is already aware. And so to the extent that there is a sensitivity or need to take into account the risk of flooding in that area, that's already on the council's radar, that's already in the SFRA. And I appreciate, madam, sometimes different areas flood, but it's reasonably obvious that if an area floods once, then similar conditions, that is the area that's likely to flood again. It'll be to do with the topography, which is unlikely to have changed very much.
Mr. Higginson, you wish to come in?
Thank you, ma'am. I don't want to get into the pantomime of, oh yes it is, oh no it isn't, but the fact is that Appendix 1 and the sites there in the historical flood data boxes basically say for a large number of those sites there's no record of sewage problems, there's no record of flooding problems, and the council's own records are, the council acknowledges, page 76 of the Level 1 SRFA, these records are not extensive. What does that mean? Does that mean they are not complete? Because I would agree with that, but I think I'm hearing that the council believes they are complete.
Sorry, Inspector, it would be helpful if the council could clarify that point.
Can we have a reference to that, so page 76?
Yes, I believe so.
Says, page 77.2, under the Environment Agency, sorry, Andrew Marsh, Mid Sussex District Council, says the majority of the recorded flood events have affected rural areas in the district. It should be emphasised that not all floods that have occurred in every location have necessarily been recorded. I think that what that is saying is that where it is recorded, obviously we've been given that information. If it hasn't been recorded, how are we to know about it?
Yeah, Mr. Higginson, I think they're basically saying that they can't say hand on heart every flooding incident has been recorded. Therefore, there may have been some flooding incident. You know, it's sort of like a disclaimer, really, more than suggesting that there's a weakness in the evidence base. I imagine that is what the council is saying there. Mr. Marsh?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
If I may, ma'am,
I know it's a bit of a palaver, given that we all know who we are, but it's important that we do this.
Tim Higginson for Wild. If the council had taken the trouble to look at, for example, the Hurst and Sayers Common Neighbourhood Plan, recording the evidence it has about flooding rather than whether or not it has a policy on flooding, then we would have had a fuller record. That was done in 2015, but it doesn't appear to have been done this time. And therefore, steps could have been taken easily to produce a more comprehensive record, and they weren't taken.
Thank you very much, Mr. Higginson. I mean, clearly, I have asked in the past how neighbourhood plans have informed the development of the plan, and that's something that I may take forward. Okay. Thank you. I'm not going to take the issue of where instances of flooding have taken place any further. However, in terms of the SA, I understand that the specific sites that have moved forward, the Environment Agency says that the changes in circumstances relating to, because I think you would accept that the changes in the climate change provisions, and obviously the fact that the framework has changed to state that all sources of flooding are now required to be considered. Does this put the way that the SA was undertaken into any, other sites that were SA'd? Should they be reviewed in the context of the new strategic flood risk assessment?
Andrew Marsh, Mid Sussex District. Thank you, Mr. Brown.
I'm just reminding Mr. Marsh.
Andrew Marsh, Mid Sussex District Council. That would only be the case where the new SFRA and the old SFRA differed in their conclusions. And as I mentioned earlier on, the old SFRA, if we call it the old SFRA 2015, but with up-to-date mapping, so the document was 2015, the up-to-date mapping did include, as we know, the up-to-date flood zones, the surface water flooding layers provided by the Environment Agency, and the climate change allowance. And so our full site selection process and the SA process, both at Reg 18 and Reg 19, took those into account. And as we mentioned earlier on, when we received the early draft of the new SFRA, it wouldn't have changed our conclusions on that matter. It was simply reinforcing what we already knew. and that perhaps was no surprise given we were using the most up-to-date data already.
So why did the EA ask you to undertake a fresh SFRA?
So the EA weren't strong. Sorry, Mr. Marsh, Mid Sussex District Council. The EA weren't strong in telling us that we had to. They said many local planning authorities are choosing to, due to the climate change allowance. Consideration should be given as to whether the current SFRA requires an update. It is for you to determine whether the local plan review is supported by a robust evidence base. And actually, as we saw in their statement of common ground, they also agreed with us that that work, even on the 2015 SFRA and that mapping, was a robust evidence base for carrying out the plan to date. So it wasn't a requirement from them that we did it, it was a suggestion which we took up with the same result, end result.
To be fair, that's not strictly true, is it, in terms of some of the sites where you have increased areas which have moved up? In your appendix 2 of the exceptions test, you have sites where the quantum of land which has moved into higher risk has increased. Has it not? What, It may be that I've misunderstood, but your sequential exceptions flood risk, your August 2024, yeah, must be. Appendix 1, findings of the sequential test. Appendix 1, I may have misrepresented what I've looked at, and if I have, please let me know. It's Appendix 1, findings of the sequential tests.
Yes, that's correct. So just picking on the first row
Sorry,
of that. Sorry, Andrew Marsh, Mid Sussex District Council. So for example, it says flood zone, present day and future. The percentages have altered between the two. That would be based on both the new information and the old information, because we did have that allowance for climate change in the mapping data already. So that's why there is a difference in those figures.
Sorry, run that by me again.
So in the first column, present day, that is the flood risk zone, for example, as mapped by the Environment Agency. The future is the flood risk zone based on the climate change allowance. And that climate change allowance, as I mentioned before, was part of the live mapping on the old SFRA and is now part of the mapping of the new SFRA. So there's no change.
In terms of Appendix 2, the sites which, could you just briefly go through these sites and reference, for example, the Haywards Heath site, which is less preferred, but it's still proposed allocation. That is because you would argue that due to the sustainability of the site that you consider that's sort of a price worth paying. Is that correct?
It's correct in that yes, there are other factors. Flood risk is one of the factors, but also in that particular instance, the layout that we've received for that site is avoiding all of those areas. So that, as far as I can recall from that site, it's a wider boundary that could potentially have a yield higher than 60, but we have suggested that the site should be 60 dwellings and avoid a large area of the eastern corner of the site. And so actually the development of residential dwellings on that site wouldn't be in any proximity to those areas that are at risk of flooding. And so weighed in the balance between the other factors, that being, as we've discussed before, about proximity to services at Tier 1 settlement, that the flood risk element has been weighed in the balance.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Marsh. Will flood storage capacity be affected as a result of any developments?
Estelle Maisonial for Mid-Sussex District Council.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. You have to speak more loudly.
Estelle Maisonial for Mid-Sussex District Council. No, the flood storage won't be affected by the proposals.
Thank you, Ms. Melman. District to flood risk, including its mitigation, in terms of, obviously, if you have a clay-based area, it's difficult for the water to soak away to suds because it has to drain to get there before it will actually save the issue. Mr. Higginson, if you'd like to come in.
Tim Higginson for Wild. I'm sorry, ma'am. I actually had some further points to make about previous issues. I hadn't realised you were
I do
moving
apologise. I do apologise. I would like you to have your opportunity, so please do so.
Thank you.
I'm sure the council-
So I would like to make a point about the level 2 assessment. That says on page 4 that the objective of the test, is talking about the sequential exception test, is not to prevent development of land that has a higher risk of flooding, but rather to ensure that development safely responds to the identified risk and can be sustainably delivered. No, that may be an outcome, but it's not the objective, which is stated very clearly at paragraph 162 of the NPPF. The aim of the sequential test is to steer new development to areas with the lowest risk of flooding from any source. Now, if the level 2 assessment has been constructed on the basis that its purpose is to justify development in areas of flood risk, it's not in accordance with the NPPF and it has no value.
Could Mr Marsh respond to that, please?
I'll take that one. Estelle Maisonial for Mid Sussex District Council. I think there may be a confusion between the sequential test and carrying out the level 2 assessment. The piece of evidence that we prepared in carrying out the sequential test is about identifying those sites that are more preferable from a flood risk perspective, whereas preparing the level 2 SFRA is about providing further evidence in order to apply the exception test where relevant.
Could you clarify that from Mr Higginson, please, with reference to the framework?
So the framework set out that the aim of the sequential test in paragraph 168, before continuing about the exception test, within paragraph 169, and then the PPG provides further guidance as to the type of evidence we should be preparing to support the application of the exception test.
The principle holds good, does it not, that you should avoid areas of flooding that's your first principle, is to avoid it, and then if you can't find anywhere which is preferable, you then move on to the next stage.
Yes, this is correct.
Yes, but is that made explicit? Can you understand why Mr Higginson may be confused?
Paul Brown for the council. I think what's being said is there are two separate stages, two sorts of testing to which the NPPF refers. First is sequential test, and then second is the exception test. In this case, the sequential and exceptions flood risk, there is a separate document which goes through that process. You only get into the exceptions test if you have a site which has been through the sequential process. It may not have been sequentially preferable, but you may nevertheless need to demonstrate that it's safe. So by that stage, you've already carried out the sequential testing. You don't do it again because that's already in the bank. That's why it says when you get to this point, we're now looking at how you make sure this is safe. And that's what the stage 2 report is doing, and it's why it says we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're not going back and doing something that's already been addressed. So it isn't that the objective of steering development away from the areas at greater risk it isn't in the NPPF. It is, but by the time we get to level 2, we've already passed through that, and we're at the next stage.
It's just a question, I mean, the wording's pretty, it's like, I don't want to be critical, but to state that in line with the NPF, the sequential approach should be used in areas known to be at risk now or in the future from any form of flooding suggests, doesn't make explicit that you shouldn't have, first of all, you should have actually tried to go somewhere else. I mean, I know that it isn't the actual sequential and exceptions flood risk test for district. It's in a separate document, but it's not clear that the reason that you're at that point is that you've already determined that you don't have enough sites that are completely in flood risk 1.
Paul Brown, Mid Sussex. I think the intention was obviously that the documents would be read as part of a sequence, but bearing in mind, understandably, members of the public may not read it with the same knowledge as to how the cascade works. If you felt that it was necessary to go back and put a paragraph in here or a sentence which said, you know, the NPPF emphasises the importance of steering development away, the question of the extent to which that is possible has been addressed in the sequential assessment. This document now goes to the next stage, which is of those sites which are going forward, can we make sure that they're safe, and we concentrate on that. I'm sure that can be done. We could easily ask whoever drafted this to go back and have a look at the wording there. I take your point in that regard. We could make it clearer if you felt it was necessary. There's no dispute about that, ma'am.
Actually, Mr. Higginson's got me thinking about other issues as well. In terms of surface water mapping, how is that addressed? Because page 6 states that surface water mapping does not strictly describe the same conceptual risk zone as is defined for river and sea flooding, even though it is notionally associated with the same probability. What do you mean by same conceptual risk? This is the bottom of page 6.
So the stage 1 SFRA.
No, it's a sequential exceptions flood risk test, August 24. Because you talk about it's quite technical. It says this. It is not anticipated a sequential test for surface water necessarily requires consideration of alternative sites at lower risk, as the widespread and dendritic, which I have to admit I don't know what it means, nature of surface water flood risk is conceptually very different to river and sea flood risk. What isn't risk?
Estelle Maisonial from Sussex District Council. This is the advice we were provided by the LLFA in terms of...
Sorry, I'm finding you struggle to hear you. Very softly spoken.
So we included that information based on advice we received from the LLFA in terms of associating various identified area with a certain level of risk. So the table 1 at the top of that same page is showing the equivalences, although in terms of testing, and in particular when you get to the exception test, this equivalence is not transposable in that respect, because when it comes to testing for an exception test perspective, we only look at flood zones.
Sorry. Yeah, it's on. Yeah. In fact, the surface water testing is treated differently from other flooding. Is that what you're saying?
At the exception test point, yes. That's probably the simple answer. In other stages, there would have to be refinement, and we've identified this would be carried out as part of the flood risk assessment at the application stage, at the point of the detailed application for our proposed allocations.
Paul Brown, Mid-Sussex, and ma'am, if it helps, there is case law from earlier this year which supports that approach, that certainly where you are in areas of overall lower risk, so flood zones 1, for example, you may have surface water area flooding in those locations, but there's no requirement as a matter of national policy to carry out the exceptions test in relation to those. And if need be, I can dig out the case on that and provide you with a copy. I don't have it to hand, but...
Thank you, Mr. Brown, but my understanding was that there was, I mean, it may be the same test case, but there have been various planning appeals where people haven't undertaken a sequential test relating to surface water flooding, and then the cases, you know, the appeals have been dismissed on the basis that that hasn't been undertaken correctly. It might be helpful if you could put that in the examination library. Mr. Wilde.
Tim Higginson for Wild. And sorry, I'm afraid I'm back on the previous point before you raised yours. I know this is your questions, but if I may, and I was back on the point of making reports clearer. And so this is a general point not related to specific sites. Could I raise the issue that if a planning authority is going to rely on paragraph 164A, that development would provide wider sustainability benefits to the community that outweigh the flood risk, those reasons should be given in more detail rather than simply relying on the clause?
Thank you, Mr. Higginson. I think that point may be something that the council could consider moving forward as part of any further work that it may or may not have to do in respect of ensuring that its evidence base is clear. What I was going to ask you, as just a more an off the cuff comment, I note that you had a specialist planning consultant, a flood risk consultant, undertake your stage 1 assessment. Why did you not have them undertake stage 2? Because I know that they say that you state that it was informed by them, but why didn't you ask them to undertake that further study, or author it at least? Because obviously the credence to something that's undertaken by a flood risk specialist may be potentially greater than something that's produced in-house.
Estelle Maisonial from Sussex District Council. Our consultant carried out most of the level 2 work. It's just that we contributed to producing the main report, but essentially all the data contained within the Appendix 1 has come from our consultant. Yeah.
Inspector, would that be because you consider it as much of it's planning judgment led rather than technical, or why?
Not necessarily. It's just when we discussed further work, we agreed that it was a task that we could carry out in-house with their support. So that's how we progressed to work.
Thank you. Right, I'd like to break now unless Mr Higginson wishes to raise any more issues relating to whether this was still a question. I mean, you're interested in 53, aren't you? Or did we still want to go on about the geology of the area?
No, I'm happy.
Okay. So in terms of the geology of the area, what was your response?
The short answer, ma'am, is you're absolutely right, the point you make. Sorry, Paul Brown, Mid-Sussex District Council. The short answer is you're absolutely right that clay geology makes a difference in that techniques such as infiltration are less applicable, don't work as well, may be simply unsuitable in many cases. But infiltration is only one of a number of techniques that can be used. Other techniques are available, and in Mid-Sussex, that's been the case across the board for some time. Those techniques are well known, well tried and trusted, and will be employed here.
Mr Marsh, did you want to add anything, given that you clearly have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, whilst Mr Brown?
I can run away.
Andrew Marsh, Mid Sussex District Council. All I would say is that I was nodding along to what Mr Brown was saying, so I'm in full agreement.
So what are these other means of dealing with clay?
So, as you pointed, clay is widespread across the district. We have, I think in the SFRA level 1, there was a list of different potential SUDS measures, swales, open ponds, wetlands, below ground storage, porous paving for storage, flow control, green roofs, brown roofs, blue roofs, etc. There's a long list, and I do believe in the SFRA level 1 there was a list of what would be appropriate and where, and obviously that's informed our planning decisions.
I'm just trying to just think around. If clay isn't porous, and you have porous paving, how does that work?
I mean, porous paving for storage. So it forms a role in slowing down the flow of water.
So the
it
water's
stores
actually
it
stuck in the paving?
No, slows it down, stores, and then releases at a slower rate into the clay. As I understand it, I'm no flood risk expert on the range of different SUDs, but there are, as Mr Brown says, there's a range of different measures which have been tried and tested, used in this district for a long time. And there's no impact that this plan would have on that at all.
So there's no technical reason why it wouldn't work in a clay area?
Not that there's been encountered so far in all of our development schemes in the plan already, in previous plans, sorry.
But I've had numerous consultation responses saying that since developments have been built, there's been an increase in off-site flooding. But so there's no credence to that approach.
I'd like to make, Tim Higginson for Wild, there are 2 points I'd like to make. Firstly, yes, ma'am, you're absolutely right that there are instances of developments causing problems elsewhere, which is why, of course, the MPPF requires a wider view than just the site alone. But the second point is that the particularly difficult combination is a certain type of geology and a certain type of geography. So, for example, where you have a clay-lined bowl and development taking place within that bowl, that raises challenges around storage and drainage, which are not apparent when the broad view of the geology of a district is taken. So, from our point of view, and I hesitate to mention a particular site again, but I would just say that when we look at site allocations, it's the combination of the particular geology and the geography that needs to be looked at. And when that combination is taken together, there may be some sites which are particularly difficult to develop from the perspective of flood.
And that may be something that we need to consider in detail at the site allocation stage. And I suppose it's something to flag that particularly at the Sayers Common site, where you have disparate sites, whether there's can be a coherent approach to flood risk management. Thank you. I will take a 20-minute break now because I have talked about the relevant policies, all the other relevant policies in the plan. And I think because these are I'll be talking about generic policies, I think it is actually worthwhile at this point bottoming them. In terms of the essay, though, perhaps as an action point, it would be helpful when you are, because clearly you're going to have to do extra work on the essay, aren't you? If you could sort of do a note to self, cross-reference with the new SFRA, just to ensure that you've got belts and braces, irrespective of what you've told me about how it's already been undertaken. I think it just makes it cleaner, doesn't it? If it can be demonstrated that that has been undertaken. Thank you. So we'll stop now, and can we return at 11:30? Thank you very much, everybody. It's now 11:30 and I'd like to welcome everyone back to this session relating to matter 5 of the Mid-Sussex District Local Plan. My name's Louise Nurser. As far as I'm aware, there are no alterations to the evacuation process, so we can move on swiftly. We broke having discussed the SFRA and whether the way that the council had approached flood risk matters was appropriate. I have asked the council as part of the essay to just sort of do belts and braces to ensure that it is consistent with the 2024 flood risk assessments. I just now quickly want to go through the EPS 4, which relates to flood risk and sustainable drainage. I haven't done this as yet during the hearing sessions, but it's just quite useful if we can just go through it, through the actual policy itself. In terms of this supporting text on page 57, you reference the SFRAs providing information on the use of SUDs, etc. To be honest, having had a brief look at it at the break, it appears just to relate to cross-reference to other documents. I think it would be useful if some principles could be set out within the actual supporting text, and specifically to address the whole issue of geology, on the basis that you keep talking about SUDs, but if the ground won't drain, you know, you've got to find an alternative. And it may, and I note that you could put more stuff on roofs or what have you, but so it has to be a locationally specific way of actually achieving those issues, rather than saying we've got a off the shelf approach.
Sorry, Ma'am, Andrew Marsh, Sussex District Council, can I just check in terms of your suggestions that these are going on our main modifications list rather than the action points list? Is that? Excellent, thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you for picking that up for me. Thank you. Okay, in terms of the, obviously you reference some various documents which, you know, you're going to be going through the plan anyway, aren't you, and checking for referencing documents as being part of the plan policy. So I note that you've talked about an SPD, I believe, in this text, if I've got it right. Perhaps you haven't, actually, to be fair. In terms of the second paragraph in the actual text of the policy, it's page 58. I suppose the question is, why would it be where possible? Development proposals should reduce overall flood risk. How can that be consistent with the framework? I'd be Mr. Marsh, if you want to come back on that. The point, you see the element in the policy that I'm referencing.
Just picking that out, Ma'am, be a few seconds. Again, if it's not clear, if you're not happy with that and the reference to the MPPF, that's something we can certainly take away as part of the main modification for this.
Sorry, I think you
This policy.
misunderstood what it said. In the second paragraph in DPS 4 of the actual policy itself, it says where possible. Would you be allowing so you're saying it should reduce overall flood risk? So you're saying as a it should positively reduce overall flood risk rather than not. But would you not allow an application if it didn't? And I mean, is it clear, basically? Effective.
Lord Madam, looking at it, first of all, the policy is clear where things are an absolute requirement, so you can't make the situation any worse. You must not. The words where possible, I mean, development proposals should reduce overall flood risk. You're looking effectively at a betterment, which wouldn't normally be an appropriate requirement of, but there may be circumstances in which the consequence of doing things that are necessary for the site is that you get a wider betterment. So, for example, it was the point Mr. Boyle made about his site, that if you put in a new sewage pumping station, then that won't just meet the needs of the site, it will also benefit the wider area as a whole. And I think it's at that which is the policy is directed at. It's certainly seeking to encourage betterment where that is possible, but obviously there's a limit to how far the planning system can go before you fall foul of the rules on Section 106 obligations and conditions. So it's trying to tread that delicate line. If you feel we've got it wrong, I mean, I suppose it would certainly be inappropriate to say development proposals must reduce overall flood risk. There's nothing in the NPPF that supports that. That would be requiring betterment even if it wasn't proportionate or justified. So the question is, if you can't go the whole hog, do you then take it out in its entirety? That would be unfortunate because it would be potentially giving up the possibility to improve situations. So that's why it's there at the moment. It's about as effective as it can be, I think, is the way we would put it. But man, if you're unhappy with it, then let us know what it is that you don't like.
I'm really just sort of, I have examined plans where off-site means of reducing flood risk have actually been put forward as, you know, like because an area has got a particular issue. They have stated, you know, the Environment Agency has been very keen in terms, because the framework, doesn't it, the framework sort of talks about a wider, you know, taking a more holistic view to reducing flood risk. So is there a way of making it a positive approach to reducing flood risk? As a, you know, as a strategic benefit, really. Albeit I understand you've got the whole issue of the 106, but in the same way that a developer would be happy to pay for issues that were obviously directly related on its site to reduce, well, to ensure that flood risk wasn't made any worse.
Sorry, Paul Brown, Mid Sussex. And I'm always nervous about drafting on the spot, but if it were to say something like development proposals will be expected or should or must address the extent to which mitigation measures could also or would also address wider issues of flooding in the area or something of the sort like that, so that you make it clear that you've got to address it, you've got to look at the extent to which your own mitigation could be done in such a way that it would provide wider benefits. without crossing the line where you're positively requiring development to fix a problem beyond the site boundary that actually has nothing to do with the development itself.
I think you've written the policy, Mr. Brown.
Right, well, I hope somebody took a note of that, or we'll copy it off. Well,
No, because because it's clearly you don't want to, a plan has got to actually produce something positive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And in an area where there's clearly issues of flood risk, I mean, I've experienced it when I've been driving, you know, your roads sometimes flood. If you can ensure that it's just a way of not take a bit of a more bespoke approach to dealing with flood risk in the context of your region. So I think that would be, because people might say, you know, where possible, I mean, it could be that you could spend like £1 million and you'd sort the problem. You wouldn't refuse an application on that basis, would you? But on the other hand, if someone could demonstrate that they've actually considered it, then that would.
we'll add that. Can we wrap? Do you want that as a separate action point? Not an action point, but it's sort of embraced within the point you were making earlier about changing the principles, but this is now changed to the policy itself, whereas you were talking about.
I think it's changed the policy.
Right, okay, so it's probably part of that overall looking at, but it is a separate bullet point.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, for the benefit of anyone who's in the gallery or watching via the live stream, any main modification will be subject to consultation. So please don't think it's all being stitched up here, because
And Madam, we can put forward a form of words, but obviously the modifications will be yours to, and you can change us.
it's whether goes to the test of soundness or not is a moot point, but in terms of the way the policy is written, it's always helpful to set out what the objective of it is, rather than giving a directional approach. Because, for example, in the third paragraph under sustainable drainage, no, I suppose, to be fair, this is really, to some extent, is that policy, or is that just how it would work? I don't know. I think I'll probably let that go, to be honest. Again, paragraph 4, the paragraph underneath, green infrastructure will be incorporated where possible. Again, I think that can be wrapped up in that main modification that you were proposing. Not you proposing, Mr. Brown, but the council had put forward in response, because it talks about green infrastructure will be possible where possible. I mean, it's like it's more green, and it's, where possible. Is that really appropriate at that point? Any views? Would you take that point?
Oh, sorry, no, yes.
Yeah, okay. The penultimate, the last paragraph in DPS 4, land that is considered to be required for current and future flood management and or sustainable drainage will be safeguarded from development, and proposals will have regard to relevant flood risk plans and strategies. Is that just, they'll be informed by it? Is that right? Yeah. Can you not just say it'll be safeguarded from development? We could. Because what value does it add? I mean, it's either required or not, isn't it?
So then take out the reference to having regard to. Is that the point?
I would have thought. I mean, what value does it add?
No, that's fine. I think we can do that.
Okay. Mr. Higginson, did you have anything you wanted to raise in terms of that specific overarching policy?
Tim Higginson for Wild. The only point I'd like to make bears on the discussion we had in the first half of this session, whether there can be anything added to the policy in terms of the information that should be collected to inform assessments of flood risk.
It might be helpful if the I mean, I don't think it's necessarily goes to the matter of soundness, and therefore it wouldn't be something that I could direct the council to undertake. But I'm sure the council might be, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but perhaps something in the supporting text could, Mr. Marsh, what would your feelings be on that in terms of working with parish councils in terms of information, or at least highlighting how issues relating to flood risk should be reported? It might be a separate piece of work, to be honest, but I always feel that there's no point in just saying it's nothing to do with me, because it isn't anything to do with me. But on the other hand, if it could, something positive could come out of this, that's always a benefit.
I don't see why not. On our review of the main modifications, reviewing the policy, it's certainly something we could look at.
In terms of in a supporting text, or
In the supporting text.
yes, and I think what I was also saying was that in terms of making, it could be completely separate from the plan making process, and clearly it's not really my business, but if there could be a means of ensuring that people felt that when they issues of flood risk were, there was an easy way of recording them, or at least mentioning.
We'll take that away, ma'am.
Yeah, I mean, but as I say, it's literally nothing to do with me. It's just an aside, but sometimes they're actually helpful. In terms of, you talk about the preferred hierarchy of managing surface water drainage from any development is infiltration measures, attenuation. Why don't you just say the hierarchy is? You know, I mean, I'm playing with words, but if the hierarchy is, the hierarchy is, but then isn't that, but don't you also need to ensure that it's consistent with the geology? Make sure that these developments will actually work. Because I think that may overcome Mr. Higginson's representation, where you're concerned, are you not, that in particular areas it'd be very difficult to successfully implement a SUDS means of dealing with the flood risk? I mean, I know every development will have a massive document on flood risk, but I think it's useful just to signpost that.
Full Brown Mid Sussex, ma'am, we can certainly take out preferred, I mean, the hierarchy, and I don't think it's just us saying, it's not our preference, it's pretty well established. I think we would need to keep infiltration in there, because if and so far as it is possible, we should still be trying to do that. It may be that in many cases we cascade down to level 2 more quickly because of particular soil conditions, but nonetheless, it's important that, as far as possible, we keep number one there.
Yes, I mean, for example, green roofs or something like that. I mean, would a green roof meet a infiltration? Would that be considered to be infiltration?
Yeah, I'm told attenuation, Mum.
Yes, so I just think make sure that it's site specific, relates to site specific issue. So those are sort of potential main modifications. Policy DPS, is there anything else on this particular policy that anyone wants to raise? No. Let's go to DPS 1. If the council could, you've pointed me to DPS 1 in terms of minimising the vulnerability to climate change. I'm not sure that I have got any further issues relating to that. Health and well-being. And policy I-12.
Sorry, on health and well-being.
Oh, you sorry, yeah?
If I may.
Mr. Higginson.
And this, Tim Higginson for Wild, this may not be, and I don't know where it fits in the policy framework, but there's no mention of the particular risk to public health caused by inadequate arrangements for dealing with foul water and sewage.
Criterion 10 relates incorporate measures to provide resilience against the effects of climate change, including overheating, flood risk and drought. Potentially, I don't know whether it goes to the test standards, but it might make the plan more effective if that criterion is extended to relate to foul water flooding. Because it's very easy to think of flood risk as being sort of nice clean water, isn't it? But it isn't necessarily. Thank you. In terms of planning obligations policy, I'm going to have a very that's something that when we get to it, we'll get to it, so to speak. Yeah. Okay. Some changes have come forward as part of the consultation process, specifically with the environment, in relation to the Environment Agency. Or indeed, there's one from Suffolk Wildlife Trust who put in their statement that they supported these main modifications. Perhaps the council could talk me through these main modifications. Yes.
Thank you. Our view on...
Mr. Marsh,
sorry,
Sussex District
Mr. Marsh, Mr. Sussex District Council. Thank you, Mr. Brown. Our view on the modifications are that we don't think that they are necessary for soundness, but they're issues of clarity that have been put forward to us by the Environment Agency, and as a result of that, we are happy to make them if you are.
Sorry, I'm looking at M15. That's,
yeah.
You say Suffolk Wildlife Trust and National Women.
Sussex Wildlife Trust, yeah. It's a clarification that they have put to us regarding prioritising natural flood management, and we say not necessary for soundness in our view, but it's a modification that we are happy to incorporate into the plan if you think it is.
Talked about flood risk taking multi-functional, it can kill more than one bird with, I don't really want to talk about that.
Madam, look,
Referencing
it's that age,
Wildlife
Paul
Trust.
Brown, it's that age-old chestnut about the limits on your powers, strictly speaking, and in an ideal world, if we can get to a better plan, then nobody wants to object to that. The point, certainly what's being proposed is not inconsistent with the NPPF, it's consistent with it. It doesn't mean that what's there to start with wouldn't also be consistent. And we're very happy to leave that for you. We think the original draft is consistent. We can see that actually it might be sounder if you added this in. Very happy to do that if
You can make the plan more effective.
and madam, if we're looking at DPS4 in any event,
Yes.
as you've asked us to do, it may well be easier just to wrap that up in an overall change to the policy. Perhaps we don't need then to worry too much about which bits are strictly necessary for soundness.
Well, to be fair, you can't change the policy unless there's the wording unless there's a reason. But,
Yes,
okay, so in paragraph 3, you reference under sustainable drainage system, under paragraph 3, that seems to be sensible on the basis that we want to avoid issues with foul water flooding, because obviously a combined system has foul water in it. Is it appropriate in areas like in existing urban areas? Will there be a separate?
So, could you just repeat that?
Yeah, the combined with, you talk about resisting, well, this references resisting surface water drainage to the foul sewer. Is it in all areas that you would want to ensure this didn't take place, or purely on greenfield sites?
Andrew Marsh, Mid Sussex District Council. This has been put forward by the sewage undertaker Southern Water and Thames Water to us. So
Yeah.
Our view would be that we would rely on what they're telling us.
About. Yeah. Okay. And do we use, is the word resisted appropriate? Resist sounds quite coy, doesn't it?
Yeah, as part of our main modification, we can take a look at that.
But in principle, I think that should be. Should be, yeah, you should put it in your M. Yes, will not be permitted, yeah. I thought you meant the proposed M. No, I don't mind. Right, okay, guess what, M17.
I was going to say, Mum, when we were just looking at the others, the
You'd like us
Natural
to take
England
that out.
obviously want us to put it in, but we are completely with you on the other the other action point and MMMs you already mentioned. So that would be one that we would not take forward.
Okay. Then there appears to be a MAT, oh, that's, we've now changed policies, haven't we? I'll quickly look at DP1, see if there's anything relevant there.
M9, your reference.
Oh, that's nothing to do with water though, is it? And then, what was the other policy that you referenced? Was it IP something?
DPS 6.
Sorry?
DPS 6.
DPS 6, yes. M21 isn't really relevant to today. And M20, to be honest, we'll probably be picking up
On another day.
on another day. I'm not to say that I don't agree with it, but I'm just saying that it's not relevant to today's session.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions or queries. Mr. Higginson, is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish this session on flood risk?
Tim Higginson, for a while, please tell me if this is out of order, but DPI 7, in the preamble to that policy, it says that developers should demonstrate that development will not lead to problems for existing users, but it doesn't appear in the policy, and it would be helpful in our view if it did, referencing water and flooding. DPI 7, yes.
That's one of those main modifications that probably makes the plan better, but it's not necessarily required on the basis of effectiveness, because if we make the main modification that you've referenced in terms of the health and well-being, then the fowls, health and well-being, obviously one's health is not positively impacted by having flooding in one time. Or, Mr. Marsh, did you want to come back on that?
No further comment on that one.
Okay. Was there anything else, Mr. Higginson? No, thank you very much. Okay. Does the council want to provide me with a verbal issue relating to action points, please?
Yes, thank you. In the absence of Miss Salisbury, I'm sure is watching. I'll take her place. We've got the first one, which was the legal case regarding the sequential and exceptions test, and to put that in the library. And the second one was the note regarding the SA and how the SA has cross-referenced the previous flood risk work and this flood risk work, and how that's come to the conclusions that it has.
Madam,
I don't think it was a note, sadly. I think it was just a...
it was when we are doing the work on the SA, which we will need to do,
yes,
that we should bear this in mind.
Yes, exactly, because you were going to go through it all again from yesterday, aren't you?
So it's something to remember when we get to that stage, rather than a separate thing on which you want to document.
It's sort of like an add-on, really, isn't it? Helpful. No, you don't need a note. It's okay. I don't have any other notes. There are a few MMs but you'll send them to me as a sort of informal basis. So thank you. Right. On that basis, I will close this morning's hearing session. Tomorrow, I understand Mr. Brown will not be here.
Well, Madam, I think the council has asked to me to be here, in which case, I mean, I simply do what I'm instructed to. But I certainly can be if that's what the council wants. But at the moment, I'm not quite, it doesn't seem to me I'm going to have very much to add to it. It's a washing up session, as I understand it. You want just to go through mainly to go through the list of actions, make sure we've got them right, and to possibly, I don't know whether you were looking at putting some deadlines on them, or whether there was anything else that you anticipated covering.
Yeah, I mean, we can go through it tomorrow,
Yes,
what
of
tomorrow's
course,
about, but yes. Okay, so I will see you tomorrow then, because if not, I was going to wish you...
At the moment, I believe so, Madam,
Christmas,
unless...
on the basis I won't see you before Christmas. Yeah, okay. But other than that, we'll have a meeting, we'll meet at 10 tomorrow, and we'll go through some points. It may not necessarily be going through the action points in detail, but I just would like to have a discussion with you about the way forward. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.